Hey, it's Art from My New Microphone. In this video, I'll be discussing how to organize our mix sessions before mixing to set them up in a way that is conducive to getting the mix results that we want. Having our sessions organized and set up in a way that is conducive to mixing will help save us time and reduce decision fatigue as we move our way through the mix. It will help us be more creative as we are no longer doing the little minute things within the mix session as we're supposed to be mixing. So in this video, I'll break it up into two different sessions. The first, we will organize a mix from scratch with no template. And then in the second part, I will be using a template to organize a mix so that you can see the difference between the two. I will add timestamps in the description box down below if you'd like to jump forward or come back to each of these sections within the video. And if you happen to be a Logic Pro X user like myself, I have a free mix template to offer you. I'll put a link to that in the description box down below. Click on it, sign up to my newsletter, and I'll send that to you right away. So without further ado, let's hop into Logic and get organizing. All right, here we are inside of Logic Pro, and in this video, we'll be looking at a Lindsey Meisner and the Seventh Mystic track that I'll be mixing. We have our multi-tracks right here. So what I'm going to do is just drag these directly into the session right here. I'm going to create new tracks as we are beginning from scratch here. So let's click OK, wait for these to import. I'll bring this over and let's delete this audio 1 track right here. And I'm also, you can see that my voice is coming up here on the bass track. So what I'm going to do is select each of these tracks and make it so that there's no input. The input is going to be coming from these audio tracks right here. So the first thing I'm going to do is put in the tempo and the time signature information. Now I know for a fact that this is 81 BPM and we have a 6/8 time. So let's go in here and line this up to bar 9, for example. I usually don't like lining things up directly to the first beat in Logic because I like to give a bit of room at the beginning of the mix if I'm sending it off to mastering. So right here, we'll just set it up so that the first hit comes in on the 9th beat right here. So we can see that that comes in. Let's have a quick listen with the metronome.
1, 2, 3.
There we go. So we are on time. And now what I'm going to do is reorder the tracks quickly. So in my workflow, I like to go drums, bass, guitar. In this case, we have horns, and then we'll do vocals. So let's rearrange these tracks quickly. We've got bups as in backup vocals, so those are going to go to the end. We've got voc, which is the lead vocals. I like having the saxophone followed by the trumpet, followed by the trombone, followed by the ribbon mic that is capturing all of the horns at once. US and S are under snare and snare respectively. Let's bring those up to the top. Then we'll have our kick in and kick out before those. And I'm running through this really fast to get this video on the go, but you can take your time when you are going through and setting this up yourself. Before the horns, let's put the 2 guitars right here. Let's have our rack tom in front of our floor tom. We'll bring the bass down here before the guitars. Our room will be last. We have our overhead left and overhead right here, and then we have our hi-hat. So in order, we've got kick in, kick out, snare, under snare, rack tom, floor tom, hi-hats, overheads, room, bass, guitar 1, guitar 2, sax, trumpet, trombone, ribbon mics, vocals, lead, and then 2 backup vocals right here. And what I'm going to do before we go any further is I'm going to select the 2 overhead tracks. I'm going to zoom in to make sure that they are in proper phase with each other, which it seems like they are. And then I'm going to first pan these hard left and hard right. Then I'm going to select these 2 like this. And in Logic, I'm going to join them together, which is Command J. And I'm going to make them there. So now we have a stereo track for our overheads. I'll pan that to the center, get rid of this one. And I'm going to turn this input into a stereo track. Other than that, we don't have any stereo tracks per se. So I know that I'm going to want my kick in the center along with the snare. The rack tom, I'm going to pan about 25 to the left, and the floor tom maybe 35 to the right. I usually use a sort of left, center, right approach to panning, but I don't like having the toms panned far out, especially in a more R&B style song like this. The hi-hat is another thing that's kind of in the middle ground. Sometimes I like to pan this a little bit, so let's just move the hi-hat slightly off center to 10. The guitars in this mix, I'm going to hard pan left and right. And then the saxophone, let's try to keep the sax in the middle and have the trumpet and trombone out a little bit as well. Let's choose 45 and 45 as an example right here. Note that 45 is not percentage in Logic. If you are using Pro Tools, for example, they go all the way to 100 plus or negative. In Logic, they only go to plus 63 or negative 64. So 45 is actually quite far out. So again, this isn't true LCR panning, but this is just going to be a starting point to kind of give some width, and we can go from there. Backup vocals, I'll pan those hard left and hard right. We have the lead vocals in the center. This ribbon mic is a mono mic, as is the room mic right here. So the next step is, I don't particularly like the way that these tracks are labeled. I did not record or produce this record. I'm only mixing it. So the next thing I like to do is rename the tracks. So quickly we will go through and name them to my convention. So I like this one, kick in, kick out. Snare is SNR top, SNR BTM for bottom. We've got tom 1 as our rack tom, T2 as our floor tom. Hi-hats is HH, overheads is OH. The room, I'm going to type out room. We've got bass for the bass, GTR 1 for guitar 1, GTR 2 for guitar 2. And then we'll go sax, trump for trumpet, bone for trombone. I'm going to call this one horns. And I'll know that that is the mic that is capturing all of the horns at once. The room mic for the horns, which were overdubbed on top of the rhythm section, which was the drums, bass, and guitars. And then we've got lead Vox right here. And then we got BG Vox 1 for background vocals and BG Vox 2. Once these are labeled appropriately, I'm going to go in and color code them to my liking. So I like working with the drums as red. I'm going to hit Option C in Logic. If you happen to be using Logic, you'll learn a few hotkeys if you didn't know them already. And I'll choose those as red. The bass I like as purple. The guitars I usually go blue. Maybe that color blue. The horns in this case, I'm going to put a gold color. The lead vocals will be dark green, and then the background vocals will be lighter green. All right, so we have our tracks color-coded, ordered, and labeled to the way that we like. Now let's go ahead and set up our subgroups. So I want all the drums on the same subgroup, so I'm going to bus them through bus 1. Now the bass, there's only one track, but the way I like to work is to keep everything organized and to have every audio track sent to its own bus or its own subgroup. You don't have to work like this. It's arguably more effective to just have this bass being sent directly to the stereo out. But for the way that I like and for the purposes of this training, let's go ahead and bus this to bus 2. Let's bring the guitars to bus 3. All the horns will be to bus 4. And then in this case where there's only 3 vocal tracks, I'm going to bus the background and the lead vocals all together to bus 5. Let's go over here and label these tracks now. So we have drums, we have bass, we have guitars, we have horns, and we have vocals. And I'm going to color code these the same way as the tracks that we have already. Horns are golden, and the vocals I'm going to keep dark green like the lead vocal. What I'm going to do in Logic here is create tracks so that they come up in the arrangement window right here. And what I'll do is I'll drag these up right after the last track that is being fed to that subgroup. So we've got all of our drums here, for example, going into the drum bus, and that is reflected right here in the mixer window. So we have all of our drums and then our drum bus. You can see the difference in the icon here between an audio track and an auxiliary track. In this case, the auxiliary track is the subgroup. So I know I'm moving fast, but I would like to make this video a manageable length, so we're going to keep moving forward here. We've already created all these tracks. I'm just going to drag them over here really quick. Horns are going to go right here, and then vocals are going to go right here. At this point, we're pretty well organized. What I'd like to do next is I like to do gain staging, which I have a video on the topic that I'll leave a link to in the description box below. But what we're going to do is select all of these tracks. And for this, I just like using Logic's gain plugin. You can use any gain or trim plugin that you like, but I'm going to choose the gain plugin here under utility. It's Logic's stock plugin, which gives us gain control and a phase invert. And then if we open up a stereo instance, for example, the overheads, it allows us to flip the phase of the left or the right. And then we can also swap the left to right or turn a track into mono. But that is not the main focus that we're going to be using this plugin for. We are going to focus on gain staging, which I'm not going to cover in this video for time's sake. I'll again leave a link to my in-depth video on gain staging in the description box below, but we are going to have a look at this phase invert button because we have a snare top and snare bottom, which are notoriously out of phase with each other. So right here we see, if I blow this up a little bit, that the snare top peaks positive when the snare bottom peaks negative. So what we're going to do here is go into gain, phase invert, and now that is going to be in phase rather than out of phase. To prove this, let's just have a quick listen to the snares in solo, and I'll toggle this back and forth. So you hear that it sounds pretty good. When it's out of phase, you lose a lot of that bottom end and the punch in the snare. Let me bring it back in phase. Out of phase. So we want our snare top and snare bottom for that extra punch and body in the snare to be in phase. Obviously, we want as many tracks in phase as possible. That's why, again, I checked the overhead left and right mics to make sure that they were in phase before summing them to mono. But in this case, I'm flipping the bottom snare so that it best matches the snare top. And another thing that I should have done beforehand is actually look at the overheads. So if we look at these and scroll in, we want to make sure that our snare looks good against the overheads as well. So we can scroll over to a snare hit over here. See that these again are out of phase. This is flipped, so we know that the snare top is the actual phase that we want to align to. Then if we go down to our overheads, we see here that we peak right here, which is not perfectly in phase with the snare top, but it is close enough. We can listen to these together and maybe move the overheads around a little bit as an additional strategy to help with phase coherence in the mix. So I moved that slightly. Now if we go and look at, I can even drag this up momentarily so that we have a better comparison. So again, not perfect right here. I may as well leave it at where it was. Oftentimes you can get away with nudging the overheads a little bit or nudging the snare a little bit without making the drum sound unnatural and phasey, but where this was recorded in this way, I'll just move it back to where it was, and so we can get a more coherent sound of the kit. That's just an aside that I wanted to add in case you had particularly bad phase issues, but in this case, it's not overly pressing. Okay, let me move the overheads back down to where they were, right before the room, and I'll unsolo. And what we can do now that we are pretty well organized is set up our basic processing that we will typically use in a mix. So I know that I'm gonna want a bus compressor on the stereo output. I like the Waves SSL comp right here, the G master bus compressor. So I'll put that on the mix bus right now and then deactivate it quickly. And I'll do the same thing over here on the drums. Now I have a few go-to plugins that I could share, but ultimately this is up to you if you want to add plugins in before actually getting into the mix during the organization process. You'll see that in my mix template later, I already have a lot of inserts. These are just starting points that I'll usually tweak a little bit or get rid of altogether depending on the mix, but they prove as a good starting point to get into the mix with. So we could go on and add a few more inserts like a compressor and an EQ on each of the drums, the bass, the guitars, the horns, and the vocals. but for this instance, we'll go ahead and continue with the organization of the mix. One thing we will do, however, is set up our effects returns and parallel channels that we think we'll be using in this mix. So what I usually like to do is set up a number of different tracks right here and just think about what this mix might need. So usually I will opt for a bit of parallel compression, particularly on the drums. So I'll call this drum parallel compression. I also like a nice stereo delay and a mono delay to give a sense of space to the mix. I also like a snare plate reverb, just to help give a little bit more roominess to the drums, although we do have a nice room mic in this record. Another thing we can do is have a vocal reverb, and I like a long plate for the horns. Additionally, I like to have a guitar verb on the opposite side of each guitar. So I'll call this guitar verb L and guitar verb right. And what I do here is I have this one panned all the way to the left, this one panned all the way to the right, and the left effects return I will feed with the right pan guitar, and the right effects return I'll feed with the left pan guitar. And as a last insert right here, let me see, maybe a little bit of parallel saturation for the vocals, which can really help bring out the character of the vocals in certain parts of the mix. Now, additionally, I might want to add a vocal throw, which could be a delay or some sort of special effect. So maybe I'll want 2 of those for this mix. And I'm just spitballing based on what I know of this song. I would recommend you listen through your song in its entirety and kind of brainstorm what sort of effects you would want to set up on your returns. And I'll just add another one right here on the vocal throw. And what I'm going to do now is select these. In Logic, if you hold down Option, you can route linearly from a set point. So for example, I'm starting with drum parallel compression and I have all of my effects returns selected. So I'm going to go start at bus 11. This is usually how I like to work. I start here at 1 and then my effects at 11. If I click 11, then this is going to go linearly. So we have bus 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21. I'm going to keep these down. Let's make the verbs mono. I will make this mono delay mono as well, and everything else will be stereo. Now that we have these, let's consider what we may or may not want to send to these tracks. So for example, the drum parallel compression, I'm going to send all of my drum shells to that most likely. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to set this up before I even get into the mix so that when I'm in the mix, I can just send levels as I see fit. This isn't really a necessary step because it's very easy to set up these sends, but it's just another thing that I don't have to go through in the mix, which allows me to streamline the mixing process that much easier. So we're going to send these to the drum percussion, and you'll see in Logic that if you are searching for a bus, it will now tell you what I labeled each of these effects returns, which is nice. So the drum shells are going to drum parallel compression. Let's go to the snares and the toms, which I'd like to send to the snare plate. The stereo delay, maybe I want the guitars, each of the close mics of the horns, and each of the vocals to go there. So let's set this up to bus 12, and the vocals, let's tie those together in the mix with a nice mono delay as well. Again, I'm not adjusting the sends, and these effects returns have their faders all the way down at 0. I'm just setting this up for what I believe might be the case in the session so that I can easily just grab these and send as I please. And you'll notice here that while I'm choosing to send the individual tracks, I could also just go to the vocal subgroup and send from there. However, I have more control over each independent track if I'm sending from each independent track. So that's why I'm doing it this way. So as an example, I could go to the horns subgroup and send all of the horns to the long plate on bus 16. And now before bus 16, we have our Vox verb and our long plate, along with our guitar reverbs. So let's go to the vocal reverb, and I'm going to send all of these to the vocal reverb. And then let's move over to our guitars. So the left panned guitar is going to be sent to the guitar verb R, and then the right panned guitar is going to be sent to the guitar verb L. This is a nice opposite side reverb trick that I like to use. And beyond that, we have our parallel Vox. So let's just send the lead vocal to the saturation. Again, only if we need it. I may very well end up getting rid of this when it comes time to actually mix. but I just want to set myself up with a nice routing workflow that I can mix into rather than having to think on the fly of creative ways of routing my session. And then additionally, I will send to the 2 vocal throws right here. And now that we have that set up, I like to go over and actually input the various plugins that I'll typically use. So first and foremost, I like a simple channel EQ. I'll choose Logic's channel EQ right here, and then it also gives me a visual representation up here on the track level in the mixer to give me a good idea of what I'm doing for EQ. Next, if I drag this up, we have drum parallel compression. I like the SSL compressor. I'll usually opt for the punch setting right here, which has a long attack and short release to allow the transients to come through while still clamping down. And I'll drive that threshold really low so that I get a lot of compression. Then I'll usually add a little bit of saturation or distortion after that to give even more punch if needed. So I usually opt for a Soundtoys decapitator, and I will mute that along with the SSL comp and only bring these in as I see fit within the mix. Stereo delay, I like just using Logic's stock stereo delay. I think it's a great plugin, and I know from experience that I like to use a 180 millisecond delay on the left and a 220 on the right, and no feedback on that. As for the mono delay, the tape delay is actually really good in Logic, but you can use any delay plugin. And here I like a little bit of feedback, maybe 20% as a starting point. Again, these are all starting points. I'll turn the wet all the way up because it's an effects return. And I like to bring this into a quarter note to kind of lock it into the tempo of the track. As for the snare plate, I like another one of Soundtoys plugins. The Little Plate is a fantastic plugin. It emulates the EMT 140 plate reverb, and it sounds absolutely amazing. I'm just going to bring this down to 1 second just as a starting point. I'll mute that as well. I'll also go in here and mute these. As for the vocal reverb, let's go with another Little Plate. I'll have this one a little bit longer. And I know, again, from experience that I like a more dynamic reverb. So I'm going to go in here. Just Logic's stock compressor is a great one for this. I'm going to keep it on the digital platinum. It's nice and transparent. Turn the audio gain off. And I'm going to go here and select the side chain to be the lead vocal. So I have a video on this dynamic delay and reverb. I'll leave a link to that in the description down below. But effectively, I'm going to add reverb to the vocal on this effects send, and then I'm going to duck that reverb while the vocal is present and then have it swell up after the vocal line is done. This is a pretty common mixing technique that you can use for yourself. So I'm going to choose lead vox right here as the sidechain and leave it as it is. I'll turn these two off. The long plate, I'm just going to use Little Plate again. It's great. And I'll boost this time up to about 4 seconds. Again, I'm going to adjust this in the mix. This is just getting things set up and ready to go so that I can quickly move through the mix workflow once I get to mixing. In terms of guitar verb L and R, there are a few different plugins that we can use for reverb. I like a spring reverb on guitar, so I've been messing around a little bit with this soft tube spring reverb, which is pretty nice. I'm going to choose a mono instance of it because we want a mono reverb panned all the way to the left in this instance. And I'm just going to copy that over to the guitar right as well. So let's close both of these down. Then I have a parallel saturation. Now we've already used the decapitator, but I like the FabFilter Saturn II. This is my go-to saturation plugin. It's a multi-band one. There's a lot you can do with it. I have a video discussing the different types of saturation, and then we also look at a few different saturation plugins. Both the Saturn II and the decapitator are well represented in that video. I'll leave a link to that one in the description box down below as well. And then the vocal throws, I'm just going to open another one of Soundtoys plugins right here, the Echo Boy. And I'm not even going to bother with a particular setting in this. I'll just move the mix to all the way wet and duplicate that over here and close both of those down. So there we go. We have all of our effects returns that I think I might want to use so that once I'm in the mix, I can quickly just send and mix my effects returns without having to think about routing or opening up different plugins and experimenting with different things. I know what I like. I know what works in my mixes, and that is reflected in the organization of this mix in particular. One more thing I should mention that I would do on a track like this is I would go to the tom tracks and I would manually gate them. Now, there are a few different strategies you can use for gating toms, and the basic premises behind gating toms and other close mics like this on the drums is to basically get rid of bleed when the instruments are not playing. So oftentimes, if you have close mics on toms, when the toms aren't playing, those mics are just contributing to noise and bleed within the mix. Obviously, we want the power and punch from the close mics when the toms are present, but when they aren't, we kind of want to have those mics not so present in the mix. So personally, I like to manually gate them, and I'll show you a quick demo of that shortly. I've seen other engineers use volume automation to bring up these tracks when the toms are present, and then to bring the volume back down when the toms are not present. And I've also seen the classic noise gate, where you can input a noise gate. In this case, this is the stock Logic Pro noise gate, and adjust the settings so that when the tom hits, the audio in the signal will be strong enough to open the gate, and when the toms are not playing and there's just a bunch of bleed from the cymbals and the snare, then that will not be enough to open the gate and the track will effectively be muted. So personally, I prefer going in my mix organization and preparation stage and manually gating the toms, which means just going in, and I will typically solo them. So let's solo my talkback and these two toms, and I'll listen back. So I would go here and cut this rack tom, get rid of that, leave a little bit of a tail end on it like this. I'm just doing this super quickly. I noticed that the floor tom has very little sustain to it, so I would go through and maybe cut this right before the cymbal as well. Then I would go through and listen. So there's another tom hit right there. Use my eyes to see what the big peaks are in the audio, and then go through and manually cut it like that, deleting everything past it. We'll go back here. This looks like a tom hit. So I will go here, cut it right before. Again, the floor tom doesn't have a whole lot of sustain, so I'll cut that right before the next hit, delete this, and so on and so forth. Once I got through and did everything, I would make sure to go in here and add in a fade in and a fade out, just so that there's not that digital popping coming in when the toms are present. And that way I can get rid of the bleed the way that I see fit and not have to rely on a gate, which can be a bit chattery, and not have to go through the process of using volume automation, which I find, at least in Logic Pro, to be much more tedious. It's a bit less tedious in Pro Tools from my experience, but in Logic Pro, I much prefer this manual gating. So I just wanted to add that in before we wrap up this section. So beyond that, I would go through and gain stage everything, and then I would get to mixing. Again, we're not going to cover gain staging in this video, but I would basically just run through the mix and make sure that every track is about the same level with all of the faders at unity, usually around -20 to -18 dBFS. And that helps to maintain adequate headroom while also giving me a strong reference point of how loud each track is going to be. So if all the faders are at 0 and all the tracks are at the same level, then if a fader is below another fader, then it means that that track is quieter than the tracks that have faders that are higher than it. There are a few other benefits with gain staging in the digital world as well that I talk about in the gain staging video. So with that, let's do this over again, but with a mix template. All right, here we are for round 2 of organization, and this time we will be using a mix template. This template is the free one that I have available for you. Again, there's a link in the description box down below if you'd like to check that out. So again, we are going to start with our multi-tracks right here, and what I'm going to do is drag these in once again, and I'm going to create new tracks, but then I'm going to drag the individual audio files to their appropriate tracks within the mix template. So let's go OK right here, wait for those to import. And you can see already that I have a lot of the routing done. I have all of the effects returns done right here, including, again, the drum parallel compression, snare plate, stereo delay, mono delay, guitar verb left, guitar verb right. We have a couple of extra delays, a long plate, vocal reverb, and then an extra parallel compression bus right here. So not exactly the same as I did in the previous section, but again, I have these effects returns set up and ready to go along with all of the processing that I may need. In this instance, I have the effect before the channel EQ, but I would rearrange these as necessary when it came time to mixing. If we scroll over as well, you can see that there is a gain plugin at the top of each of the audio channels. And then we have our subgroups right here that are fed by the appropriate tracks. So again, we have all of the drums feeding into bus 1, which comes in bus 1 right here in the drum bus. The bass is sent to the bass bus. The guitars are sent to the guitar bus. Horns sent to the horn bus. Keys in this example sent to the key bus. Lead vocals and background vocals all sent to a vocal bus. But you may notice here as well that there are these purple tracks with no inserts available on them. These are VCAs, and basically what a VCA is a single fader that will control the level of multiple tracks at once. So you see that the snares VCA right here will control the level of all of these snare tracks at once with a single fader so that we can easily push them up and down and automate them without altering the balance between each of these snare tracks. The same thing goes for the kicks over here and the horns over here. You see that the horns are sent to the VCA right here. And then I also have a background vocal VCA right here as well. So I hope you see the immediate power of using a mix template. So much is done for me already, and I can just go about and move these tracks into position and get most of my mix organization done. I have a video dedicated to the many benefits of using mix templates. I'll leave a link to that video in the description box down below as well. So let's bring this down. And much like we did in the previous session, let's decipher what the recording engineer named the tracks and how we can bring these tracks into a naming convention that suits us. So you don't have to use my naming convention. I would recommend that you come up with your own if it's more comfortable for you. Feel free to use mine if you'd like, but I know that this bass needs to come up to the bass track right here. I know that the backup vocals need to go to the background vocals right there. There are 2 background vocals. Let's move the vocal track to the lead vocal right there. We'll move floor tom to tom 2. We'll move the guitars to their respective channels, guitar 1 and guitar 2. I'll move hi-hat to hi-hat right here. Kick in and out, go all the way to the top. We've got our overhead left and right, so I'm going to do the same thing that I did in the other video, which is come over here, select the overhead left, bring it all the way to the left, this one all the way to the right, and then I'm going to join these together. And now that this is a stereo track, I'll drag this over to the stereo overhead track I have in the template. If we go over here, we can see that indeed this is stereo. Now let's bring the rack tom up along with the room mic and the snares. So we'll start with the rack tom going up to T1. The room will go right here to room 1. The snare and under snare will go to snare top and snare bottom. And then let's move the saxophone up, followed by the trombone, the trumpet, and the horns. So let's do this the easy way. Right up like that. And let's get rid of each of these tracks. I'm just going to delete these from the session. And you'll see that I don't need the keys or the key bus. I also don't need this background vocal track either. And let's make sure that these snares are in line. And I have a kick sample and a snare sample track right here in case I need to trigger or sample another kick or snare to help beef up the drums in the mix. I'm not sure if I'll need this in this particular mix, but I'm going to leave these 2 tracks right here just in case. So we know now that we need to check for phase. And we know from the previous section that the snare and the under snare are out of phase with one another. So I'm going to bring up this mixer window, go to this gain plugin right here, and invert the phase of the snare bottom so that it's better aligned with the rest of the drums, particularly the snare top. So there we go. We have our tracks color-coded and set up in our proper naming convention. We have everything routed thanks to the template, along with all of our effects sends over here. Again, our sends are set to 0, as well as the faders here of the actual return channels. We have our phase issues all sorted out, although we could go into deeper detail about the phase relationships of different tracks. I have a dedicated video to dealing with phase issues that I'll leave a link to in the description box down below. I would also go through and manually gate these toms once again, like I showed in the previous section, where I would just go find the toms, cut around them, and then make sure that the sustain is there, cut around them like that, and then get rid of all of this noise when the toms are not present. Make sure once you go through the entire thing to come in here and add a fade in and fade out to make sure that there's no digital pops and clicks that happen as these audio files come in and out of the mix. And with that, we are pretty much set up to go through the mixing process. The only thing I'll do again is make sure that I have the right tempo is 81 and the time signature is 68. And I'll just make sure that all of these are aligned. Again, I'll start at bar 9 in this example, and I know that the kick comes in hard at the first beat, and then we can see just visually here that the kicks are on each of these bars, with a little bit of variance, but that is to be expected. This is a real drummer, not a robot, so it's all good. So yeah, after this, I would go through again and gain stage the mix, and then I would jump right into the mixing process, having a nice organized session to get started with. All right, so I hope that that all makes sense, and you see the power in doing proper mix organization and using templates before you get into the bulk of the mix. If it didn't, feel free to leave a comment down below and I'll be sure to get back to you and clarify anything that you're struggling with. If you found value in this video, I would encourage you to hit that like button and to subscribe here to the My New Microphone YouTube channel. And as always, I have another few videos up in the top left and right corner for you to check out after this one for more information on music production and mixing. So click on one of these videos next, click that like button and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.